Hello, everybody. This is Guy Messick, and I want to thank you for attending today's webinar. This is a webinar that's sponsored by NACUSO, the National Association of Credit Union Service Organizations, and we try to bring webinars on a regular basis to our members to frankly educate them and provide them with maybe some opportunities and some facts that may be helpful. And it's an idea to extend our annual conference education on a year-round basis. I'm pleased today to be hosting, not hosting, but introducing both Bonnie Schufo and John Deering, who will provide this presentation on how to put together opportunities, in this case, really a case study. I've known John for a number of years. He's with Capstone. I've worked with John on other deals, and I had the pleasure of working on this deal with Bonnie, who is with South Carolina Financial Solutions and is a client of mine. So without further ado, let me turn this over to John and Bonnie, who will give the presentation.
Thank you very much, Guy. As always, a pleasure, and I agree. I think we have a wonderful program for everyone today. We'll have the opportunity to share some real-life deal experience with you, which will include not only the strategic rationale for the pursuit of this particular transaction, but the process that we went through with Bonnie and her organization and the seller, and also share with you some of the key learnings from this particular transaction. Start out by echoing Guy's comment and thank Bonnie for her time and her willingness to share the success story and educate others in the credit union world. And of course, thank NACUSO for the opportunity to continue to build upon our relationship that we have developed over the past couple of years. I'll just kick things off with a little overview snapshot, if you will, of Capstone, and turn it over to Bonnie to give you an overview of South Carolina Financial, and then we'll take it from there with a give and take. And it always is more interesting, quite frankly, for all of us. If folks have questions that they want to inject, feel free to use the technology to type them in, and we'll address them on the fly, and we'll hopefully have some time at the end as well to continue the dialogue with you. A quick snapshot of Capstone to get us started and get people thinking. We're growth engineers. We were founded back in 1995 with one major principle in mind, and that was how can we help strategic acquirers do things better. And that spans having the strategy, upfront work through due diligence and primary research to get educated about the markets and the players, and also the advisory side for deal-specific situations that might be one-off like this situation, and running acquisition programs in general. The main thing that we help on the front end is crystallizing the M&A strategy. The middle piece is really around the custom research and finding out where niches are that might be most appropriate and attractive to fit with your strategy. And then the final, certainly, the building the relationships that we'll talk a lot about today through the closing. I've been lucky enough to work in the world of credit unions personally for almost a decade now, working with CUSOs and credit unions alike, and enjoy it, want to continue to do it, and one of the reasons that we're here today. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Bonnie and ask her to provide everyone a bit of a background on her organization. Bonnie?
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Of course, I'm Bonnie Schufo. I'm president of South Carolina Financial Solutions, and we are, of course, a wholly owned subsidiary of South Carolina Federal Credit Union. We offer a variety of services. Indirect lending was our beginner CUSO, if you might say. We started that probably in the 90s, I believe. And then in the last couple of years decided to expand our CUSO offerings, and we now offer insurance to our members and have rolled out an insurance offering to our first credit union client in South Carolina, and we also offer talent management, co-location services in our state-of-the-art data center, as well as benefit consulting.
Wonderful, wonderful, and clearly we're going to get into a little bit about the current state, and I'll dial back the time in a little bit to say that, you know, when we talk about current state, we're going to start with where Bonnie and her organization were thinking about the potential to grow through acquisition, and we'll take you all the way through some of the challenges and opportunities that existed through the process. And then coming out of the other side of this time together, Bonnie will talk a bit about where they are and where they're headed with the post-acquisition. So great, and let's get rolling here. I think the only other thing that I wanted to say here is thank you, Guy and Nacuso. As Guy said, this is just a continuation of their philosophy on education, which we share at Capstone, and Guy and I have worked on a number of common clients over the years and had fun together getting deals over the goal line. And it does need to be mentioned that we share a common university in our backgrounds as well. So go Buddy. Yeah, we have a lot of fun together. So all right, let's move forth. So I talked a little bit about our model here at Capstone, but I want to put it in perspective for this particular case study. We're generalists when it comes to marketplaces, but we believe that the process and the tools that are utilized throughout the process help people to increase their likelihood of success. As everybody's heard over time that has an interest in M&A, you know, 2/3 to 70% of acquisitions fail. So there are some common reasons that we believe that they do, quote unquote, fail, and we try to reduce that percentage for our clients by utilizing a process and holding clients accountable to the process and maintaining objectivity throughout. We have 3 steps is really the foundational piece. Starts with the team and the strategy and benchmark against vision and risk profile. Then you need to really select kind of where you're headed, and that's the prioritization of markets and segments, which is where we pick up the story, because quite frankly, Bonnie and her group had already figured some of that out when we got involved. So instead of talking historically about the foundation, most of our chat today will be about the relationship side with owners and what it takes to build the deal. So I'll just pause there and say that the quote at the bottom is really something that I want you to, bottom of the second column is something that I want you to take away from today's discussion, and that is that no matter what company you think is attractive, whether they're thinking about selling or not thinking about selling, you got to figure out what the owner's motivations are or a partner's motivations are and build a win-win. And that's what I think is the crux of our message today, is trying to figure out what the right equation is for not only your organization but also for the owner on the other side. Bonnie, anything to add as far as the setup before you start addressing the starting point?
No, the one thing I do recommend for everyone is, you know, I actually had seen John at a presentation at Nacuso 2 years ago. And when we started thinking about this process, you know, in some cases you might be able to do some of these things on your own, or you think you can do some of these things on your own, or you already believe it's a win-win situation. But in the end, for the protection of yourself, the company or that you'll be acquiring, it's always best to get, and in this case we'll prove it was best to get a third party involved to help get through the situation, make sure all the pros and cons are looked at, and then in the end everybody knows what in the end when the deal is done, you all have an agreement of what that deal is and how you're going to move forward from that time forward. So.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in just one thing, and that is our whole philosophy is we try to complement our clients' resources. So at the beginning of any situation, and this one is a very good example, Bonnie, of you know, you didn't need everything that we had to offer. You just needed bits and pieces of it, and quite frankly, I think that an open dialogue at the beginning about needs, wants, and desires is critical, not only with the owner on the other side, but in a relationship such as ours as well. So I think that it's every organization is a little different, every QSO is a little different, every credit union decision making is a little different, but there are some common themes that we'll address. So.
Right.
Okay. Well, Bonnie, with no further ado, I guess before Capstone got in the picture, you had done a lot of work. So why don't you share a little bit of that backdrop with folks?
Sure. Well, originally, the company we acquired was Innova Plan Strategies. The owner was James, or we call him Jim Feedy. And we had been doing business with Jim for 20, I would say, maybe not 20, probably 10 plus years on benefit consulting for all of our benefit needs, starting from, medical, non-medical, and retirement. And so in the process one night, fortunate for me, I was a trustee on our 401k plan, and Jim and I were at dinner with some of our vendors, and I just said, Jim, I said, is there something we can do together? Because Jim really did an excellent job for us over the year. Just to give you an idea, we would get a renewal rate on health insurance premiums of 27% from our, with the original renewal rate, but we've never paid more than 5% on a renewal rate. And that's all due to Jim's expertise and being able to work through and understand not only the industry, but our plan in particular. And so as part of what we wanted to do as a QSO was to help other credit unions, and thought, gosh, we just need to be able to get Jim's name out there and be able to help. So Jim and I entered a joint marketing agreement, and where we would work with him to get into the credit union industry and to try to present what things that he could offer in the credit union industry. And along the lines of that, the more we talked and had been going through it, I started asking Jim about, well, what's going to happen when Jim's not here? Because Jim and his wife at the time, his wife were the two people who basically ran and managed the company. And I was certainly thinking from a continuity standpoint of our organization, but what happens when Jim goes away? And so he and I started talking, and talking about what his retirement needs were, what his succession plan was, and in the end decided that, hey, why don't we consider bringing you in under our umbrella? We took advantage of being able to provide all administration for Jim now, so things that he really didn't like doing, all the administrative stuff, we can handle for him, and he can go out and grow and develop the business, and in the same time, we would be able to provide succession planning for him by eventually bringing in someone else or some more people to learn the business the way Jim knows it, and to be able to move forward from that standpoint. And I will tell you, Jim is, it's just like with anybody who has grown their own business, it's his baby. And so part of what we did with Capstone was making sure that we knew we fit through our existing business relationship, but it's a little bit different when you go in and take over somebody's business, and you might start to change things, or what if your thoughts of the direction of the company are different than his thoughts. And so that's what we worked out with Capstone. And when we talked about it originally, like I said, there are a lot of things we could have done on our own, but in the end, you want to make sure you have that unbiased third party involved, not to mention, with the expertise that they had to keep the project moving, but to be able to address all those questions that we had, not only that we had, but that Jim had along the way. And so we went back to our board and talked to them about it, and certainly they agreed that we should use advisors in trying to move forward with this purchase.
Wonderful. Well, I think that one of the big things that I recall from the beginning of our conversations, Bonnie, was exactly that, which was, we don't know what we don't know,
Right.
and maybe because of our long-standing relationships, perhaps our vision could be blurred through this process. So that's why I used the word objectivity earlier, because I think that's one of the things that you were really looking for, was kind of an outside perspective. So.
Right, right. And, you never want to be caught on the back end thinking, we have been kind of tooting Jim's horn for year after all the wonderful things he's done for our credit union. And you don't ever want to be in a situation where you go through an acquisition process, and because his vision was slightly different than ours, and in the end it looked like a bad deal, when it really would have never been a bad deal as long as you addressed everything, all the concerns up front.
Well, that's a good segue, Bonnie. I think the next thing I think you've started to delve into already, which are, at the time, what were some of the biggest questions that were going through your individual mind, but also your organization's mind?
Well, certainly, we knew from our perspective that Jim and then the service that he provided was a great asset to us. But, quite honestly, we didn't know how much, other than just having conversations, but how much money could it make us? Is it worth what he was asking for it? All those things that how you determine and evaluate the company. And quite honestly, when you're talking about a company that doesn't have, it's not a bunch of assets, physical assets, and you're going and buying the company, how do you value that company? And those were things that Capstone was very good at helping us work through. And fortunately, and the nice thing is Jim had a vision of what he wanted in terms of the price of the company. And all we had to do was say, okay, not just that, but the value of the company, did the value of what we were receiving, was it worth the money he was asking? That was number one. And then the second thing is, since we did have that existing relationship and we always had this, not so much a blurred vision, but we had a certain perspective of who Jim was and who his company was, it was great to have Capstone go in and dive a little deeper and say, are there things that we don't know about or we should know about, to make sure that on the back end, at least it was addressed. Doesn't mean everything has to be perfect when you go into it, but a lot of times if you just address and discuss in the front, on the back end it's much easier because you've addressed it and you know how you're going to move forward together versus individually.
Yeah, and I think dialing back in my mind, I think that, one of the main questions was not only, do we both want to do this deal, but how do we maintain the very positive relationship that we have with the owner, yet negotiate, something that's a very good deal for us as well? It's got to be a win-win, and part of that win, quite frankly, is, the relationship side, because you weren't looking to bring Jim's organization in-house and part ways with Jim.
Exactly.
It's not as though, we use the analogy all the time, it's not like you're going in when you're making an acquisition of a business, especially, as you said, a privately held business that, is their baby. It's not like a used car. You're not going in negotiating the lowest price possible and then moving on. We say, you're buying that car and you're driving off the lot with the owner, the salesperson, in the car, and you need to work with them for the next X number of years. So you don't want to have,
not even the owner. I think you're driving off with the person who built the car.
Right, absolutely. And you want them on board and excited about growing the business together, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So that was one of the key, I think, one of the key things that you were challenging Capstone with was, this relationship is critical, and let's make sure, no matter what, that even if we part ways and we can't get a deal structured, that the relationship continues, right?
Right,
So,
exactly right. Yeah.
And there are a lot of questions, and Bonnie touched on a lot of these already. The deal structure, the strategic fit, again, I don't think was a major issue in this particular transaction, because you were past that point. You had worked with them for years. The negotiation certainly was. The relationship was. The valuation, people engage us just to do objective, unbiased opinion on deal value all the time. But this was a situation where, as you alluded to, there was already some initial dialogue around that. Now it was a matter of, okay, does that make sense for us? Can we get the right return with the right assumptions moving forward? And we had a lot of working back and forth with that. And quite frankly, it's not just in a box, meaning in a box between Capstone and Bonnie and her team members. You also want to embrace the input from that owner, especially in a situation where, again, you're not parting ways, right? Because there's usually a piece of the deal structure that's going to include incenting that owner to do something. Okay?
Exactly, and that was critical, because certainly that's the question my board asked. What happens when something happens to Jim? What if we, so when we worked on the deal, and John and his team were instrumental in having us understand, okay, so the purchase price was split between an initial purchase price and some follow-up notes that we have, as well as some payments on the back end with continuing business, and then also how long Jim was going to stay with us and what that meant. And so we worked all that in through that whole process, so that we know that Jim didn't just sell to us and then in a year or even less decide to walk away. And not that I ever even thought of that. The whole time we were having the conversation, Jim's like, I want to stay involved, even in in 5 years, if I decide to scale back a little bit, I still want to be involved. And so John and his team were very instrumental in us working that out and tying it to incentive and dollars over time, so it made sense for both Jim and for South Carolina Financial Solutions.
Yeah, and one of the challenges in that whole thing was around, because you had such a strong relationship, and we see this a lot, because of the relationship was so strong, it was a matter of how much do we want to put in the legal documents around dotting the I's and crossing the T's on those relationships as well, right? Because you have a trust already, and you didn't want to necessarily be the one to be pushing the envelope, so to speak, on some of those issues. And quite frankly, we were a sounding board for Jim as well. As we pushed things out to him, I remember on a number of occasions driving home from work, I'd be first on his phone call list, because things he was just thinking about, what are the implications of this?
Yeah, and John, I will say that was, to me, that was critical from Jim's perspective, because let's say we didn't get you involved in this whole thing. We just went out and spent the money, got Jim in, and we didn't go through all this. I can tell you, I'd be dealing with, instead of being in a position of being able to go from day one, drive business, start to go out and find additional business, I'm sure I would be dealing with a lot of more emotional situations of, if it wasn't, oh, that's not what I thought, that's not what I thought. And fortunate enough, John and his team, Jim, felt very comfortable with them to just call and ask questions and know that he could bounce those off of John and his team. And when John and his team didn't know the answer, they called me. And so it kept a fair amount of independence so that the answers were straightforward, but it also gave Jim the comfort that his concerns were being addressed as they came up through the process.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. When we're talking about communication, it's not just with your board internally. Part of what makes the world go round here is I didn't have any challenges whatsoever. I took the venting, if you will, from Jim to, got it down to a couple critical points, was able to go back to Bonnie, and, much like I didn't know all the answers, Bonnie didn't always have the immediate answers. There were some challenges that she had to go figure out within her organization before we got an answer back to Jim. But at least the communication was open, where Jim felt, as Bonnie's saying, comfortable to express those concerns. So, so listening to the seller, in order to, our job in a nutshell here, with all these questions that Bonnie's stated were out there, our job is to listen to both parties, listen to the buyer, listen to the seller, blend all those answers together, and really find the right equation that puts all these puzzle pieces together. Visual-wise, I like the way that the puzzle pieces come together, because it is, it all comes together, and in each situation there are certain puzzle pieces that are larger, heavier magnitude, or whatever, heavier weight, But in the end, you got to figure out the way to make it all work together, mesh together, and that's how you get both parties to join forces, so to speak. And this is not, again, most of the situations that we get involved in are situations where these aren't adversarial type situations. These are these are friendly discussions, and it's not meant to be, you know, we're going to buy you and put you out to pasture. It's more a situation where we have a vision. In this case, at South Carolina Financial, we have a vision for where we want to go. This is an element, an opportunity to add this business to our portfolio to be able to bring more to the credit union world and the space, create value for our ownership, create additional opportunities for members of the credit union, and so on. And it's all got to come together, because if things ended up on the other end of the spectrum, then Bonnie would have to find a new partner, right? And that was, again, back to my comment earlier, that was first and foremost. Due diligence, I think, was also key in this, because Bonnie and the board, one of the reasons that they engaged with us, quite frankly, was to, you know, they knew this business, but they didn't necessarily know, and they knew the owner, but they didn't really know the ins and outs of the business relationships, the process that he goes through to get business, and the supplier relationships that he had, and which ones were more important than others. So there was still a fair amount of due diligence, and the due diligence, quite frankly, was not just to find red flags. You know, our philosophy, it's not just, I mean, it is color red in this puzzle, but it's not exclusively about finding the problems. It is also, how can you identify opportunities that you can leverage during integration as well. So I think that was also one of the outcomes, that through the dialogue, Bonnie was able to have a very nice setup for integrating this business. So,
right.
Shall we move forward, Bonnie, or do you have more on this?
Nope, I think we should move forward.
All right, beautiful. So in this particular one, I think that we set it up with some of the background. We've already delved into some of the interesting challenges that we addressed, but now we thought that we'd just kind of walk through kind of a few what I'd classify as stages in the process. So Bonnie, you're welcome to handle this one if you want from your perspective, and I can chime in. It's up to you where you want to go on this one.
Yeah, well, we'll go ahead and get started on this, and certainly this first one, evaluation of the strategic fit. And one of the things that came to my mind as John and I were discussing having this webinar was, how many times have you gone out as a credit union or a QSO and bought something because the salesperson said, oh, it's a great thing, and they promise you the world, and when you get in on the back end, let's say a core system, and the technical aspects of what you had to do to implement it were completely different than what the salesperson had to offer. Well, you can also have the same thing on an acquisition like this. The perception of the business owner and what is great and what works well and what's successful may not be the same vision that you have. And so the evaluation of the strategic fit, not only in terms of the business itself, but in terms of the vision of the business itself and how you work together and take that solution to market. So that was critical. That was a critical piece in evaluation of that strategic fit. Yeah, we already knew we did business with them. We already knew we liked them. But is his idea of a great business and what it's worth and what it offers to the industry the same as ours? And we worked through that. The second thing, of course, is the objective perspective. Again, I say there are a lot of things you can probably do on your own, but just having the third party there, not only from the evaluation standpoint, but from the personal standpoint, being able to talk to both me, talk to Jim, and making sure that we got our concerns addressed. Open communication, of course, through the whole thing, not just individually, but as we work together as a team. One of the things that was important for me especially is I always wanted to make sure whatever I do in the QSO is successful from a board perspective. And a lot of times, even if a business fails, As long as you've been open from a communication standpoint and y'all are all on board, your board understands what is the objective, what are you getting, what's happening, you've communicated it, even if something doesn't work the way you thought, you all had the same vision going forward. So that's very important. Of course, protect the owner relationship. In this case, you want to make sure, like we said, it was Jim's baby, and we wanted to make sure that he felt comfortable with the pieces of the business he was going to have to release for someone else to do. The piece of the business is going to have a little bit more oversight than he has ever been used to. So those are things you have to make sure you address up front. And then finally, in the end, is once you get all those things settled, is how you get the deal, how you move the deal forward and get finally sign it and get the sale done so you can move forward together.
Yeah, and I think that a couple of thoughts. One is, I said earlier that Capstone gets involved in developing the M&A strategy as well as running acquisition programs, and the third piece would be the deal advisory piece that we did on this particular transaction. But even if we parachute in, as we did in this particular case, you know, the challenge questions need to be there at the beginning of the process, as Bonnie said about the strategic fit. I mean, it's great that you have a deal opportunity. That's fabulous. But you know, let's make sure that you have a deal opportunity in an area that makes sense for your organization and where you're driving the organization's goals and objectives and vision moving forward. That's kind of fundamental, and I think that South Carolina did a great job of making sure that that was indeed the case. The other piece of it is defining, quite frankly, how you're going to objectively evaluate this particular candidate. Once you've figured out the service offering and the capabilities that you're trying to add to your organization, as Bonnie did early and often, the next thing is, okay, Jim, quite frankly, was not the only fish in the sea, so to speak, that had that set of capabilities, right?
Right.
So the second challenge question is, you know, why that organization versus the others that could bring that capability to bear, and how does it stack up against the ideal prospect that if you could step back and say, okay, I want this set of characteristics for a perfect acquisition candidate. How does it benchmark against that? So how strategic fit and then prospect fit and attractiveness is I think, key. And so early on, you want to ask yourself, no matter whether you have a deal in hand or whether you're just thinking about pursuing growth through acquisition as a strategy, I think those are two fundamental things that I'd highlight based on what I heard Bonnie say. And one thing that we love to do, Guy knows this, Bonnie knows this, is we like to use throughout the process some tools to bring objectivity to it. And this is very, 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 very high level, but bear with me as I use it as an example. What we suggest is that before you get serious with a candidate is to figure out, again, without a company in mind, figure out what the criteria is for the best case scenario candidate for you. And these are by way of example. First, you want to figure out what the criteria set looks like. What's not on the screen is the detail around how do you define what the ideal product or capability is, how are you defining the ideal customer base, how are you defining the ideal geography, how are you defining the ideal technology, infrastructure, humans, capabilities, background, distribution channels, pick your poison, size, profitability, you know, cash flow, lots of options. And then not all of those things are created equal, so we suggest that you figure out, for benchmarking purposes, the relative weights behind them. And then as you have a candidate, you start to say, okay, how does this benchmark against the ideal? And then, oh, by the way, how does it benchmark against the other options that are out there, the other candidates? So it's a matrix kind of organization that allows you to compare apples to apples across the ideal and across candidates. So that's just a tool that I'd ask you to think about if you are in the world of proactively looking at acquisition candidates. Bonnie, any additions to that?
No, I think that, I mean, that was right on. And you know, your weights might be a little bit different but that's what you deal with. That's what you work out with Capstone before you, if you're going to go in on the front end, that's what you do beforehand. And what we had to do was on the back end, since we'd already had something, that's we had to do this on the back end. So.
Yeah, and I think the key is it's not just, and I'll use Bonnie as an example. It's not just Bonnie's criteria because there are other people in the decision-making chain. So what you want to do is try to craft something that's built through consensus, that's built through to drive alignment. Because one of the things that we'll talk about in a little bit is just that communication protocol. And one of the keys in all QSOs I've worked for is, reduce the surprise factor, right? So if you can identify what the ideal looks like, and people are buying off on the ideal situation, and then you bring them something when you need money that is close to that or is that, you have a higher likelihood of success. So.
Right. Yep.
Okay. So because the situation was privately held, as Bonnie said earlier, which I love this, is the company is the owner's baby, it was Jim's baby, there is a lot of psychology involved in this. And I just wanted to take a moment based on our experience with privately held owners to talk a little bit more about listening to their needs. And I use the phrase, what are their hot buttons a lot internally here and with clients. So you want to try to do your best early and often when you're talking with private owners to figure out what drives them. What are their hot buttons? There are lots of different reasons why they could sell. They could be interested in selling because they're nearing retirement age. They could be interested in selling because they want some liquidity and they have all their eggs in one basket, and that is the company, and they've invested everything into it. They might not have family members coming up in the business or any one succession plan. They may not have another way, reducing risk and or liquidity. They're related. And then there are lots of reasons why they might not sell. They're too young to take the age thing the opposite direction. They might have had a bad experience recently in their business, so they're not on the top of their game, so to speak. So they might not be excited about disclosing information because they had lost a customer, or they in the midst of a negotiation with a partner, or so on and so forth. They might have alternatives that they could turn to, and you're trying to win them over versus those alternatives. They might think or know, based on rumor, that you, the potential buyer, might not pay a lot or might not pay up, or whatever the case may be. So there's lots of factors going into this. So Bonnie and her organization did a great job, obviously with lots of history, of already knowing some of Jim's, as Bonnie said, knowing some of his hot buttons, knowing the insight into timing, knowing what he was thinking about succession. So some of those things were already figured out before we even got involved, which was great, and it was a great platform from which to lead from. Some of them were... Go ahead.
John, just a quick thing. He had actually gotten into a position all the way to contract negotiation with a previous company to sell his company. And in the end, they brought in one person that just didn't seem to have the same vision, and so Innova decided that that wasn't going to be the right fit. So anything can be that one thing that says, I'm not going to sell.
Yep, and no two situations are alike, Bonnie, I assure you. Absolutely. Yep. And there are different ways to skin the cat too. I mean, you have to look at yourself as an organization and say, how flexible am I going to be, right?
Right.
In a couple of transactions recently we've been working on, the age thing came into play because, not only were they not willing or not interested in moving on, the sellers, but they saw a huge opportunity to join a larger organization and play an active role in building something new and exciting and bigger. And so where we ended up on those discussions, a little different than where we ended up with Jim, was, taking a less than 100% stake in the business and showing both parties a path to get to that 100% ownership over time. But getting everyone aligned and growing together doesn't have to necessarily be 100% ownership and an employment contract. it could take different forms. So just be a good listener and understand that they don't need to sell. And they're not, most companies that are not in dire need of selling are the ones that you want.
Right.
Or said another way, the ones that are for sale, perhaps you should question why they're for sale. So anyway, what the general thing about the psychology with the owner is, what does it take typically to get them over the hump to move more toward selling, and more importantly, selling to your organization? That's you don't want them going to an auction to go out and sell the business to the highest bidder and take you against 8 of your friends. You want to try to position yourself to be the only one. And what we've found over time is there are a lot of common themes, but the 2 that rise to the top are the relationship, which is, as we've said, Bonnie and her organization already had great strides moving forward there. But the second one is really the buying into the vision and the strategy for moving forward. Because, as Bonnie said, Jim had some vision of where he wanted to take the business. So what I think made this deal hum is that they had a common vision together that was aligned and overlapped nicely. And so it wasn't that difficult to say to Jim, this is what we want to do, because part of what Bonnie wanted to do was what Jim wanted to do. So the vision and the buy-in to the vision was critical in this case. But I assure you, when you have target companies and owners that aren't partners today, that you don't know as well as know each other as well as Bonnie and Jim did, that is critical. Get them to buy into your vision. Convince them that your company vision and direction will help them in some form or fashion, or they can get on board and they can release their baby to you, so to speak, to go do that. So it's all, the vision is foundational. Back to our process. You got to start with that. And if you're not aligned there with the owner, it's probably not going to get over the goal line. The other thing that plays into this owner psychology section is what we call the inherent asymmetry. And that is, Jim can only sell once. Okay? And the perception of the owner like Jim, who's contemplating selling, is that, right or wrong, he or she or a set of partners that are involved in it do not have the opportunity to go back in time and get out of this. So this is a massive decision. I'm stating the obvious, but they can only sell once, and you need to be very attuned to what they're saying to you is important to them, because it is not only dollars, I assure you of that. There are lots of factors, and it's not just dollars. So you got to work on your story. You got to be good listeners, and you got to understand that they only sell one time in their life.
And the other thing, John, is it didn't happen in our case, but in some cases you might have some thought of or vision of what you think it should be, but when you listen to the owner, that may change a little bit. And so you have to be, I think we talked about it earlier, be flexible in understanding this person, especially in our case where we were going into a brand new line of business. They were the experts. He's the expert. And so, I need to make sure that I can temper my board's idea back to what the expert says and make sure that those meet.
Absolutely. No, I mean, that's on the flexibility comment, I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, if you believe that this person is coming on board, or group of people or team of people that is going to be additive to your organization in some form or fashion, you need to not only be listening to the deal points, but listening to what they want to try to accomplish. And if that doesn't match, again, if the visions don't match and the strategy doesn't match, then it's probably a telltale sign that the future's not bright. Because if you're accessing their customer base, and that's why you're doing it, is accessing the customers, but the way you're going to win those customers and attack the marketplace, so to speak, together and market and make joint sales is not aligned, there's a disconnect there that needs to be talked about before you sign on the dotted line, because as Bonnie said earlier, it's not just about the role of the individual, it's how you're going to build the business together is also critical. And again, the other thing that you got to think about here, quite frankly, is that owner is always mulling over in his mind, why should I be spending time on this? And it's got to be interested. Why should I be interested? Why should I spend time on it? Perhaps there's a situation like Jim's where they've been down this road before. You know, how is this different? You know, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this and then it not work out. You know, we hear that at Capstone all the time from owners, all the time. And that's because the marketplace, all owners are being contacted all the time. You got to figure out how to differentiate yourself. And it's usually with your story, your vision, and being good listeners and getting the clarity. And doing your homework also. I mean, that's the other thing. You got to know their business fairly well before you start winning over their credibility, or you establish credibility by knowing their business. Is probably a better way to say that. So to play off of what Bonnie said too, I think that you know, there are usually perspectives going through that owner's mind that you need to acknowledge, and I'll blend this all the way down to 2 points, and that is every time you interact with an owner that you are trying to win over, they are testing you to some extent. And there are 2 things that I'll mention. One is the speed. So what's going through their head as a privately held, smaller entity especially, is I can make decisions on my own. I can make decisions quickly. Why do I want to get bogged down in a large bureaucratic organization that won't allow me to do that? So they're thinking, that statement alone is they're thinking forward in trying to place themselves in your organization. So the test that I say is that they're testing how fast you react to their questions. They're testing how quickly you get back to them on requests. So speed is your friend. If you can prove to them that you're not slow to react, that you're not going through a committee approach, and there's going to be people that they can go to get answers when they're going through this process, and and implied moving forward, that's going to help the cause. That's the first one, is speed is your friend. The second one is consistency. Now, in this particular case, you know, I don't know that Jim did this, but I would venture to guess, Bonnie, that Jim asked you a question, me a question, the same question, and asked other people in your organization the same question, and he was trying to figure out whether or not there was consistency in the answers. Because when there's inconsistency in the answer, that points to them that you guys are not aligned about the future. So we see that all the time. We see that all the time with owners, and they're gonna be trying to find the consistency or the inconsistencies in the approach, and that's another way to turn somebody off. In this case, my belief is that everyone was aligned. Everybody along the process, there were no missteps there. You guys did the education internally. You had everybody that touched Jim in sync all the time, Bonnie. I'll stop there and ask you to comment.
Yeah, and I agree. I think I will say that there was one point in the contract where we kind of went back and forth a little bit on something, and in the end, it worked out. But you know, that's when I had to kind of toe the line a little bit and say, okay, look, I have to, you know, I know from a friend's perspective and from the previous business dealings perspective, I can't believe that this would ever be an issue. I said, but I have to think of it from a business perspective and from my board's perspective, and in the end we worked that thing out. But other than that, from the vision, from the very start all the way through the end, as we address those communication, those points, those hot points, it just worked out. And it was, again, it was the whole process, but again, open communication and having a third party to talk to for both of us, really.
Great. Well, I'm just cognizant of our time, Bonnie. I'm going to move us along here and ask you to touch on a little bit of the due diligence process and take that wherever you would like to, because I know people are always interested in how does due diligence work. So. Yeah.
So, you know, in the beginning, as you know, you heard we already had made the decision that it was a potential purchase for us. So we got Capstone involved, And at that point, it was great. I mean, John and his team, we just started having a series of conversations, conference calls, just to go over all the points, for me to take back things to my board and the rest of the team members. We'd come back together, and we just, hashed through all the particulars and that whole process that that John alluded to. And then the financial aspect, of course, they handled collecting the financial data, analyzing the financial data, coming up with what the valuation should be based on a few assumptions. And in the end, after we got through that part, went back to the board saying, okay, here's where we are. It sounds, it seems to be working out. Everything's working out. And as we started to pencil the deal, got the initial approval from the board for the funding, and went back to the South Carolina Federal Credit Union Board for capital infusion to make the purchase. And fortunately, and we were on a somewhat of a tight time frame, but John and his team kept us on task. And like he said, if he needed a response, and what was great, it wasn't just emails. If we needed a response quickly, John, they would pick up the phone and call us and say, hey, I'm sending you this email, but this is something we probably want to turn around pretty quickly. Let's go ahead and talk it out, and then we'll put it in writing. So in the end, we went through that evaluation process. We went through the pros and cons. We went through the psychology, the evaluation, all the way to the funding, the papering of the deal, the contract itself, and the signing of the deal.
Yeah, and I think the only thing that I'll add to that, because I think it all went swimmingly well because of, in part because of Bonnie's quick responses, as well as you'll continue to hear us say quick. And I think that you can never start planning due diligence too early. And I'm not saying you need to spend a lot of time and resources to get things started, but I would suggest to you, if you're even contemplating growing through acquisition, that you have to figure out who's going to be involved in due diligence. What are the top 10 by functional area that you're going to need to find out, and what are the deal killers? What is really going to stop something from happening if you find it? Because there's always the gray area in between on some things that you're going to discover that you got to make a decision on. But there are also going to be, I would suggest to you, at least a handful of items that if you discover this, you will not be comfortable doing the deal. So you might as well figure out what those top 5 are at the beginning of the process, so everyone knows that if those are discovered, that we're stopping. And we got lots of content on due diligence, but there are a couple thoughts there that I wanted to leave you with. Plan early and figure out what the top things are that you're looking for. So let's talk a little bit about deal structure and how that comes together. I alluded to earlier that it's got to be mutually beneficial. There's no doubt about it. I mean, in the end, people don't need to sell, so you're going to have to give a little, and they're going to have to give a little, and that's how the world goes round. You got to meet in the middle on some things, as Bonnie just finished saying. But there's also some things there that you got to think about some of the intangibles, the softer side. And that's what we mean by it transcends money. In this case, again, Jim had no desire to leave the business, okay? So, and that was completely okay, and not only okay, but it worked well with what Bonnie and her group were trying to do. So that, what does that look like? The devil's in the details. So I outside of the deal parameters for buying the business, the next big challenge in this one was, quite frankly, just working out what the contractual relationship was going to be for being a team member. And it was easily worked through in the end, but that became as critical as the actual the deal terms, because that was a function. That was the deal getting done was a function of that happening. So that was pretty key, and that was all built up again. That was no surprise, right? Because Bonnie had already asked those questions. We followed up with some of those questions, and we ended up figuring out early on that in order for this deal to actually happen, we had to become aligned on that particular employment contract. So anything else, Bonnie, on that?
Nope, sorry, I got muted there.
That's all right. That's all right. The other thing that I'll say for this, for everybody who's thinking about entering the world of acquisition, look yourself in the mirror and ask yourself what you and the organization that you're working with has to offer an owner. Because I would suggest to you that it's much more than money. Opportunities for growth, opportunities for their employees who, oh, by the way, they consider to be family. And even if they're not blood relatives, they're family. So how flexible can you be? What can you offer the team members? There's a whole host of things that you can bring to the table beyond money. So before you even start talking to owners, figure out what that list looks like. Then when you hear a need, want, desire from the owner, you have things to react with. And also look yourself in the mirror as well on how flexible your organization can be with regards to each of those things you have to offer. Okay, let's see here. So I think the main thing here, Bonnie, and I'll let you talk to it, but I think the key thing here was really the communication with the board and how that all worked out. So.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, I think I alluded to it earlier, but when we had the conversations with our board, and they were familiar with Innova and Jim and what he did and what we were trying to do, but it was making sure as we determined the vision, the objectives, everything that was going on, that on a monthly basis I was going back to my board, I was telling them where we were on the deal, what was going on, what were the issues we were dealing with, anything, and certainly if there were any gotchas along the way, I made sure they were involved and they were informed. And then so really when it came to the final approval of the deal, it was just a matter of a vote at that point, because they were, we had the information that I was able to provide to them month to month to month, so that they knew where we were, what was going on, and in the end how much it was going to cost, and and particularly what were the projections of the ROI of the deal on the back end, which of course was critical. If you're going to spend this much money, how quickly are they going to see a return on that money? And we worked all that out so that they knew by the time they approved the funding and approved the deal, how we were moving forward.
No, that's all true. And again, I'll just say no surprises is what you should be thinking about. And every organization has different communication protocols. So, that's key to understand at the beginning. And as Bonnie said, she was, had a normal process anyway for communication, and we just fed information and content to her for those regular updates, and it all worked swimmingly well. So Bonnie, just wrapping up here, I'd love for you to articulate to everyone kind of where are we now, and what are some of the results and the current situation?
Sure. Well, I will say that Jim is busier than ever. We've been able to utilize a customer base or existing client base that we had, and started working with them and seeing if there were things that some of the other things that we're doing on the benefit side of the house. So fortunately that's worked out great, and so he's out doing what he loves to do, and that's find business and find new opportunities. We are currently looking at a potential of putting it together some particular plans for credit unions of certain sizes, and be able to offer that plan as a group and reduce the expenses to some of our clients, as well as any new clients who might come on board. So he really now feels comfortable that all the administrative stuff is being handled, and that he can go out and drive business, solicit business, and also look for opportunities to expand the offerings that we have. And that's really where we are. In fact, I think it's probably going as fast as anyone can expect, and maybe a little faster. But I'm fortunate in that I have a board who understands that when you have the type of business that we have, and we're trying to move in the marketplace and develop something, they're willing to accept a little bit of that speed so that we can get our name out there and get and introduce some offerings that make sense for the credit union industry.
Bonnie and John, I do have a question from the attendees. What if we don't have an acquisition target in mind? How do you find agencies that are for sale?
John, I know you got this one.
Oh, yeah, I mean, we have a whole process around that, guy, so whoever asked that, thank you for the easy one. Yeah, I mean, in the not-for-sale world, we do a lot of primary research. So back to the comment earlier about understanding the marketplace before you even get to the prospects. Because we're talking to the market and the value chain, we identify acquisition candidates through that process for our clients. Obviously, there's a ton of secondary research that can be done to identify and build your prospect pipeline. And then it's a matter of using that criteria tool and whittling down the universe. So we have a three-step dance, so to speak. The first is identification. Then you whittle it down through screening to a manageable number. Then you call all those companies and you get profile information and you develop a prospect profile against the criteria to get to a shorter number. Out of that, the clients decide which ones through a scoring process, which ones we're going to contact the owner. Then we contact the owner blindly and we do what we call an owner attitude to assess whether or not the other side is interested, or said another way, what they would be interested in, and filling in the data gaps. Then our client decides whether they want to move forward and disclose their strategy to that individual and to the marketplace, so to speak, and then we bridge the gap moving forward to set up the meetings and share introductory materials and work forth toward the letter of intent and the due diligence where we started this engagement. So research is your friend, education in the market, selecting the right market, and then from there the prospects will come. But we don't presuppose anybody's for sale. It's our job working with the client at the beginning to understand the strategy and vision so we can articulate to that owner or set of owners what the strategy and vision is and convince them that our client is the right home for their business. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, and I will tell you, if at some point, if we decide that we're going to pursue that, we already know we're going to go back to Capstone. We've already had some preliminary discussions with them. The idea is that we want to make sure we're successful with what we're doing with this new line of business, but at some point, if we decide we want to acquire, we're going to probably start from scratch at that point and go through the whole process with Capstone.
Yeah, and I think I want to, I know just looking at my watch here, the last thing that we just wanted to cover with you are some things to take away, what I classify as key takeaways from today. And I think I just put the bullets up earlier as the question came up, but communication, always your friend, utilizing an outside advisor in this case, it worked out quite nicely for Bonnie and her group for the reasons cited. I think, you know, if you're trying to protect, quote unquote, the relationship, that's something that really requires a lot of thought in making sure, again, that people are aligned internally. I think that, as Bonnie said early on, making sure that your theory of a good strategic fit is actually reality is critical before you really jump in with both feet. My comments about the right equation and not just focusing on the dollars and price, I think, was something that came out in this deal for sure. And that's related certainly to the hot buttons and putting together the right equation. So those were some of the key points that we wanted to make sure that we were able to get through and put out there for you to consider from today's session. And certainly if you want to learn more, let us know, and we're happy to share the presentation, tools, material. We do as much as we can to get out there in the world of CUSOs and credit union land. Our blog is another resource. We have webinars. Certainly continue, please, with all the great content that NCUSO has to offer. And Bonnie has certainly been more than open today, and also made the offer that her email and contact information could be included. So if folks don't feel comfortable chatting with Capstone about their questions, Bonnie's out there as well to help out. So delighted for the opportunity, Guy and Bonnie, and thank you very much, Bonnie, for your insight and time.
Thank you, guys.
John, one last question since we have this. Have you ever seen a purchase agreement that essentially pays for the acquisition through cash flow? over
Yeah,
time?
absolutely. You know, every deal's different, Guy, and you know, in today's world of trying to access new services and new technologies, and a lot of our clients, as I said, were strategic acquirers, so they're trying to access that capability in the team. They end up acquiring companies that aren't necessarily you know, driving a lot of cash flow in the current year, the trailing 36 months or trailing 12 months. So it's all about the future together. When you get into situations about the future together, you typically have some kind of an earn-out situation component in the deal to make everybody happy and whole. That's the deal term that usually a lot of time is spent on. And occasionally, yes, the answer is it's occasionally 100% futuristic.
Very good. Well, with that, again, I thank both of you for giving a very informative conversation. I think some people understand that they want to put deals together but don't quite know the mechanics of it. So thanks again, and thanks everybody for attending. Take care.
Thank you, Guy. Thanks, Bonnie. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.